So welcome back. Thanks for joining us tonight. As we now are in our, oh, we got one more coming. In our third session, our second with David Zvi, on AI and Judaism and the challenges and opportunities that it presents. And as I had framed on Rosh Hashanah, which seems like a whole lifetime ago, the moment that we find ourselves in, not dissimilar perhaps to the emergence of any other technology, but hopefully with the awareness of those past experiences of being able to shape and set some ground rules and influence the way that that technology is used and implemented, hopefully for good and not for bad, before it spreads like wildfire. And maybe it's too late, I don't know. But to try to bring a Jewish lens, at least to the conversation, if not ultimately to the implication or to the application of AI. And tonight we're going to look at that through the lens of education. And so I'm going to turn it over to David Zvi. And just a reminder, we've got about an hour and 15 minutes or so, David Zvi, till about 8:15 our time. Then people start to wane. I had a board member who once said it, the mind can only absorb as much as the tush can endure. So David Zvi, it's over to you.
Great. Well, my personal preference is always for shorter classes. I always, I have like an issue where when I am anxious, I like add sources to sources because I'm like, am I saying enough things? But I always try to go for shorter. So you'll excuse me if we finish more quickly. I just want to start with a little bit of framing about what we can kind of hope to get out of these kind of engagements between Judaism and artificial intelligence, because I think that isn't always clear. There is a way to approach a kind of Jewish engagement with artificial intelligence or any kind of other new technology, where the point is to say, like, okay, a new technology has just come on the scene. My job is to go look through the vast tomes of the Jewish tradition and find in them some place where Jews have said something that is at least on point, or like half on point to what is the contemporary conversation is. And I think that's often the first instinct. And often those texts, as we looked at last time, are legal texts. The reason that I think that's the first inclination is because many of the people who are engaged in that kind of work are experts in Jewish law in particular, like those the elements of the Jewish tradition that they know best. But I personally find it to be a little bit lacking. And I find it lacking in part because there is often very little chance that those texts will end up having a real influence on the policy conversations at hand, because most people who are involved in artificial intelligence policy or genetic editing policy or regulating social media don't really care what any particular Jewish text has to say about the issue. And what ends up happening is it's a way of saying, like, well, we're here too. Like, it's not like we have nothing to say about this. It's like, it's a one step better than nothing. And that's fine. But I think it's a little bit aimless. And I think as the issue of Jewish approaches to technology becomes more and more important in the future, it's going to be very important to think quite clearly about what actually is the point of having Jews engage in this conversation at all, and what can they hope to gain out of it. And I want to suggest there's kind of three things that this kind of engagement can do realistically. One is it provides a kind of framing. It's not realistic to say that that Jewish leaders who have jobs, have other things to do in their lives, are going to keep up with every single beat of the development of a given technology and respond accordingly. It's just not going to happen. But instead, what they can do is tell stories more broadly about what is this technology doing in people's lives, maybe take it outside of the kind of exclusively technological realm and compare it to other kinds of issues that we have, issues around human dignity, the way that we value human life, things like that. And I think those broader frames are something that religious communities can uniquely offer and bring to the conversation, and to kind of pull back and look at the big picture, because very often, especially with the pace at which technology changes, it's so easy to look at just like look at the economics of the issues, or look at like what's going to be happening next year. But to actually look at the bigger picture is important. That kind of takes advantage of the fact that religious communities are often a little bit slow. And says that slowness is actually not a problem, but it is a benefit. It's a benefit to say, like, we are going to respond to kind of broad trends and not particular movements. So that can happen sometimes. The second piece, though, is that as much as you might hope that Judaism has an impact on tech regulation, it's inevitable that these technologies are going to affect Judaism and Jewish practice and Jewish people's lives. And tracing out exactly what those changes are going to look like, I think, is incredibly important, because there is some control over that. There is some control over exactly what it means for, say, artificial intelligence to have an impact on Jewish education. And we're going to look at a little bit of that today. That is critical for the third way in which there is a kind of benefit to engagement, which is that Jewish communities can serve as kind of petri dishes. By which I mean, tech regulation is complicated. A lot of the time it happens between people who are kind of already specialists in the field, either because they work for tech companies or because they're regulators or policy experts in this particular field. And it's all well and good. It's good for those people to be engaged and to kind of develop good regulations. I think the Biden administration has done a pretty admirable job of trying to push AI regulation in particular forward. But at the end of the day, there's no substitute for human beings, for communities actually figuring out, like, what do we think about this? How should this exist in our lives? And the only real way for people to figure that out is to actually play it out, is to play it out in the communities and to think through, okay, we tried this was the impact. And Jewish communities can actually do that. They can do those kinds of experiments to see, well, we think AI should have this kind of relationship to our community. And other communities can look at that, they can compare notes. And over time, you develop a sense of what is the right approach to these things. And so I think that role, even though like it's not glamorous in the way that I think like a lot of technology presents as being kind of glamorous and like, world shaking and, humanity changing, but it is essential. And I think it's an overlooked superpower of particular communities. So I think there's a lot to gain. What I want to do today is talk about the relationship between artificial intelligence and education in three kind of frames. The first of those frames is to think about, let's say, plagiarism and the importance of citing sources, which I know if you are anywhere near the field of education, has come up pretty regularly in people's work. I know I have colleagues who regularly find papers that have been written, are suspected of being written by artificial intelligence. I know that there are kids from middle school on up who are finding that the assignments that they had to write can now be written instantaneously by AIs, and teachers are thinking about what are the kinds of assignments that I ought to assign, given that this is the case. What am I actually trying to train for? And what is the point of these classes? What are we actually trying to optimize them for? So that's one piece of it. The second piece is kind of looking more internally and thinking about, not every issue about artificial intelligence in education is unique to the Jewish community, but I think there's one particular way in which artificial intelligence is going to have a pretty radical change. It is going to affect a pretty radical change in the way that Jews understand their own texts. And I want to look at that. And then at the end, I want to talk about what I see as some really exciting possibilities for where artificial intelligence and Torah are going to align in the future. Because the truth of the matter is, this is an area where Jews have long been leaders, not about artificial intelligence in particular, but in terms of Torah and digital technology, Jewish text and digital technology. There has been so much interaction and collaboration between those fields, in no small part because there's lots of Jews who are programmers. And I think there's really exciting possibilities for the way that that Jewish learning is going to develop in the future. So let's start with source citing. Well, there's a really, really straightforward way to start this, which is that the Gemara says, the Talmud says in multiple places, you have to cite your sources. Rabbi Elazar said to Rabbi Hanina, whoever reports a saying in the name of he who says it brings redemption to the world. It's not just like, a nice thing to have, but there's something kind of grand about it. And I think for the rabbis, this is not like a small thing. The rabbis, if you understand like what it means to be a rabbi in the 3rd century, the 4th century, like they are developing this entirely new kind of Judaism. And that Judaism they are insisting is connected to the Judaism that goes back to Sinai. And so citing sources for them is not just like, a kind of courtesy. It's a way of demonstrating like this is legitimate, this is real, this is authentic. And so, I mean, there's something like lovely even about the formulation here that Rabbi Chanina is saying this thing Rabbi Eliezer is saying this thing in the name of his teacher, Rabbi Chanina. So there is this strong sentiment within Judaism very early on that citing sources is important. The problem is that for all that Jews and all that rabbis insisted on the importance of citing sources, there was another religious community that insisted on it a little bit more. And that was a little bit more, let's say, systematic or thorough about their citation of sources. And that community is Islam. So if you like kind of imagine like the moment that Islam starts, right? Islam begins and it quickly conquers huge amounts of territory in the Middle East, in North Africa, going to Spain, almost getting to China. And as Islam forms out of the kind of community of people who are around Muhammad, who like hear him saying certain things and kind of like, you know, jotting down in these kind of like random fashions exactly what he says and how he said it, there develops this deep interest in systematically evaluating every single last thing that anybody recalls Muhammad ever saying in his entire life. And not just kind of systematizing that, but evaluating those statements based on how sure are we that this actually happened? Do we have multiple reports of this statement being said? Are the people who reported that statement, are they known to be trustworthy people? How many layers of transmission are there between us and the person who originally heard that from Muhammad? Because, you know, fewer layers of transmission, kind of like broken telephone, you know, fewer layers of transmission means it's more likely to be true. And so in early Islam, and you'll understand why I'm getting to this in a second, in early Islam, there develops this intense interest and a kind of a science develops around how do you make sure that the ideas that you have around both the things that Muhammad said and did, and also the Quran itself are 100% accurate in a kind of evidence-based way. And as Islam is developing this, it is also looking at the religions around it, the religions, including the religions of the people that it has now conquered, Jews and Christians, and saying, we're good at this. We figured out a science for this. You guys are the one who have to prove that your traditions are really accurate, that the things that you were saying to us are true, and that you're not just making up or corrupting your tradition on purpose. I just want to give you a sense of this, like to kind of compare the way that that tradition tracing works in Judaism and Islam. So you see in this text, it says Rabbi Eliezer said that Rabbi Chanina said. The next text is from a Tabari. Tabari is a very early Muslim historian, commentator. And I haven't actually given you the thing he is citing. I've just given you the kind of the beginning of the citation, what's called the isnad, like the kind of the chain of tradition going back to Muhammad. And you can see that it is much longer. And not only that, every single thing, I mean, like every single paragraph in this book starts with a chain of tradition like this. So there's a level of intensity that kind of gets ratcheted up. So this happens. Jews who are living around Islam are obviously influenced by this. And there is a real sense, or it's kind of crisis within Judaism around, well, how do we actually demonstrate that the things that we are saying were actually true? How do we know that the things that we were saying actually have any evidence in reality? And one of the kind of the real champions, one of the people who tries to kind of provide a real answer to this is Maimonides. Maimonides is one of the most important philosophers in Jewish tradition. He lives in the 12th century. He's born in Spain. He has to flee Spain because of persecution, travels through North Africa, makes it all the way to Palestine, decides not to live in Palestine, and ends up residing in Cairo for most of his life. He spends most of his life just kind of like sitting around writing. He's very lucky. His brother is a merchant who's like regularly traveling between the Middle East and India. And so he kind of like lives off of his brother's wealth. Eventually, his brother dies in a shipwreck, and Maimonides has to go to work as a doctor. And so Maimonides has this like incredibly, a prolific writing career. And it's a career that is fully engaged with the Islamic world of the time. I've just shown you, I could not resist because I came across this last week, and it's just lovely. One of the things that's amazing about Maimonides is that we know a lot about him as a person and not just his writing. And in fact, we have his own handwriting. We have like quite a bit of his own handwriting found in the Cairo Geniza, which is this incredible archive of Jewish documents. The document I've given you on the right is from an article that was published last week, which is a recipe in Maimonides' own handwriting for how do you make lemonade, not as a kind of refreshing drink, but as a way to induce a person to vomit, as for some medical reason. So, who knew? I guess, lemonade had two purposes. Maimonides is very engaged in this question, and he, in a lot of his work, he is involved in this project of saying, like, well, we have to provide an answer. We have to demonstrate both to ourselves and to the world around us that the things that the rabbis have said are actually authentic, that they are in fact correct. And so he goes to a great deal of effort to both trace out exactly how we know that the words of Torah that we have received, the oral tradition, the Talmud in particular, really do have origins that are legitimate and verifiable and authentic. But beyond that, he takes the entirety of what he sees as being the oral tradition and tries to compile it into a single book, because he thinks, it's a problem if this stuff is just kind of flying around. There has to be one book that actually contains all of the things that we consider to be authentically transmitted Torah. And that book is called the Mishnah Torah. It's an important Jewish legal text. But one of the funny things about the Mishnah Torah is that Maimonides does not cite his sources. By and large, he does not cite his sources at all. So despite the insistence that we saw earlier on that, you bring redemption to the world if you cite your sources, Maimonides really doesn't. And luckily for us, he provides a rationale for why he doesn't. Not in the Mishnah Torah, but in another one of his books, in his commentary to the Mishnah. I've given you, I just wanted to show you because, when I teach about people like this, I want to actually bring them to life as like human beings, not just as like, brains who lived 1,000 years ago. So Maimonides, he writes in Hebrew sometimes. He actually late in his life regretted that he didn't write more in Hebrew because he realizes that there's like all these Jews in Europe who won't understand what he's saying. But most of the time he's not writing in Hebrew, he's writing in Arabic, and he's writing in a particular form of Arabic called Judeo-Arabic, which is kind of like Yiddish, and like Yiddish as being a kind of Germanic language that is written in Hebrew characters. So Judeo-Arabic is Arabic that is written in Hebrew characters. And so I just want to give you a sense of like what that actually looks like on the page, because I think it's like you don't end up seeing it so often. It's not a language that shows up so much these days. So in Maimonides' commentary to the Mishnah and Avot, in his commentary, he gives an explanation for why he is not bothering to cite his sources. He says, "It's important to know that I did not originate the idea expressed or the explanations offered either in these chapters or in my commentary to Pirkei Avot, but in fact, they are collected from the words of the sages in Midrashim, the Talmud, and other works, as well as from the words of earlier and later philosophers, Jewish and non-Jewish, and from the works of many others. Accept the truth from whoever utters it. Once in a while, though, I will quote verbatim from a well-known work without indicating that it's a quote. There's nothing wrong with this, since I'm not taking credit for what someone else already said, and because I hereby acknowledge what I will be doing." So he's like, just know that every once in a while, I'm going to quote somebody. I'm not going to tell you that I've quoted them, but just know that it's a thing that I'm going to do. Now, why is he doing this? He says, "I will also not say so-and-so says this, so-and-so said that, because that would be unnecessarily wordy." So first of all, it makes it inelegant. Furthermore, it might make a reader who does not accept the author concerned think that what he said is harmful or has an untoward meaning that he is unaware of. Therefore, I decided to leave out the author's name, for my aim is to help the reader and explain what is hidden away in this tractate. So that is to say, if I wrote my amazing works, but in my amazing works, I was constantly telling you the sources of my material, what would end up happening is you're not evaluating the works. You're not evaluating the ideas themselves. Instead, you're just evaluating like, well, I trust that person. I don't trust that person. And so I'm going to kind of dissect this work and only pay attention to the pieces that are from people who I like, and then ignore the parts of the work that are from pieces that I don't like. Maimonides is saying like that actually undermines the purpose of my project. The purpose of my project is to create a new body of work, a new holistic, compilation of all of Jewish knowledge, all of rabbinic knowledge into a single entity. And if I'm interrupting that by telling you the provenance of all these materials, it actually loses some amount of authority. What I think is going on here that I think is very relevant to the conversation around AI is this kind of tension between the need to cite sources on the one hand, and on the other hand, the need to have works that are original and are somewhat removed from, separate from their origins. Because there are certainly kind of two ways of presenting the same material. Sometimes you can present material in a way where you're saying, like, I am just deriving this material from some other source. Hopefully people do it honestly and don't pretend that they come up with an original idea. But there is something that kind of gets missed, or there is an opportunity that's missed when people present their material simply in the name of somebody else. And the opportunity lost is the opportunity to say that there's something original going on here. I think this shows up in artificial intelligence itself in a really dramatic way. Artificial intelligence these days is able to create all kinds of amazing images, right? So if you type into, any artificial intelligence software today, like, give me an image. I did this yesterday for something else. Give me an image of Jerusalem in the year 2100, and it comes up within 30 seconds of a Jerusalem with its lovely stone walls and flying cars in the air. Now, where does that image come from? In some ways, it is a kind of mashup of a million different images. All the images of Jerusalem it's seen on the internet, all the images of future societies it's seen on the internet, it is compiling out of that huge collection of work, this new image. Now, you could cite a source. You could cite a whole bunch of sources. There are so many sources that they're almost impossible to cite. But there is a way in which having original work means that you have to, at some point, kind of separate the new things that you're doing from their past. And actually suggest, despite the fact that everyone has origins to their ideas, origins to their work, there is also a need at some point to say, this is separate, this is new. It's new perhaps because it is qualitatively different. It is new perhaps because it is improving significantly on the things that came beforehand. And so, leaving aside the question of plagiarism as a kind of legal issue, or plagiarism as a kind of, as a kind of loss of trust, there is also this question about how much do you, within AI systems, how much is it important to kind of hold on to that past? And when is it actually worthwhile to kind of say, I'm going to present this as original, despite the fact that, of course, this work, like all works that human beings create, are in some ways rooted in the past. So that's piece number one. But I think this kind of connects to a second issue, a larger issue around the way that we think about Torah itself and the way that we think about Jewish knowledge. Because, look, there's all kinds of knowledge in the world. There's all kinds of ways that knowledge is presented. These days, the ways that people can capture ideas, can receive ideas, is more diverse than it has ever been before, right? You can be in a talk like this, you can listen to podcast videos, text, whatever it is. There's all kinds of ways of imbibing knowledge. But there is something that has long existed within the Jewish tradition about an understanding that it's not just the content that matters, it is the packaging of that content that matters. And I want to show you how this shows up very early on. So in the Talmud, there is this idea early on of how there's actually two Torahs. There's what's called the written Torah and the oral Torah. The written Torah is the Hebrew Bible, more or less. The oral Torah is all the things that the rabbis talk about, all their discussions, all of that. And the rabbis in the Talmud understand the distinction between those two things. And critically, they think that distinction needs to be reflected in the way that those two kinds of knowledge are packaged. So just to kind of read the end of this, I'm looking at 5 lines from the bottom here. The school of Rabbi Shmuel taught the word these in the mitzvah records in the verse, write you these matters, is used in an emphatic sense. These matters, that is, those recorded in the written law, you may write, but you may not write halachot, that is, mishnayot, and the rest of the oral Torah. I'm sorry, I meant to read the beginning of this. Rabbi Yehuda bar Nachmani, the disseminator for Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, expounded as follows. It's written, write you these matters, and it is written later in the same verse, for on the basis of these matters. How can these texts be reconciled? Meaning there is a contradiction in this verse. In one verse, it says, you're supposed to write something. And the other verse, it says, al pi meaning the word peh, mouth. So are you supposed to be writing something, or are you supposed to be uttering something? And the way that they reconcile it is by saying, this means to teach matters that were written you may not express orally, and matters that were taught orally you may not express them in writing. That is to say, very early on, the rabbis have a regulation. The regulation is that the Hebrew Bible actually must be read out of a scroll. That is the only way that you can consume that knowledge. You're not supposed to kind of like memorize it and then just kind of recite it off the cuff. You have to be reading it out of a scroll each and every time you get that information. By contrast, oral Torah, the rabbi's corpus of knowledge, is the exact reverse. You are never, ever allowed to read it from a scroll. You can only recite it off the cuff. It can only be the product of pure memorization. Now, the reason for that, it seems to be, is that the rabbis actually think there's a difference between these kinds of knowledge, that there's a way that you're supposed to evaluate, appreciate the Hebrew Bible that is different from the way that you're supposed to evaluate and appreciate rabbinic knowledge. And because of that, they don't want people to get confused between the two. And they worry that if you see somebody reading out of a scroll rabbinic knowledge, you're going to think, oh, that's this other kind of knowledge. It should be revered the way that the Hebrew Bible is revered. Or by contrast, if they see people just kind of randomly reciting verses without looking at a text in front of them, they're worried that people are going to take those texts less seriously. And so there is a sense in which the content and the packaging are not divisible. They are not separable. They need to be connected. Now, this kind of falls apart because eventually the rabbis do write down the Talmud. They write down all kinds of things. And so that kind of goes away. But the idea that the packaging of Torah matters is still present it shows up over and over and over again in all kinds of other contexts. And the place where it after this moment, the next place where it kind of really rears its head is with the invention of the printing press. So the printing press is invented in the 15th century by Johann Gutenberg, who is pictured here. Gutenberg and Jews are very early adopters of the press. There's lots of Jews who immediately recognize that the press is a great way for a people who are scattered across many different countries to spread their information and to get ideas around. And so Jews are, emphatic early adopters of printing. But at the same time, there is a real and significant pushback, criticism within the Jewish community about printing. There is a concern about what it's going to do. And the reason that there is a concern is that before the printing press comes in, yes, there's lots of texts that are written. They're written out by hand. Those are important. But at the same time, rabbis, Jewish educators, have a central role to play. So if you're a student sitting in the Beit Midrash somewhere in, Poland or Germany, yes, you have some text in your room, but you also care quite a bit about what your teacher has to say because they embody a certain kind of knowledge. And if you are a person who, wants to ask a question of Jewish law, you could look it up in a book, but mostly you're going to go to a rabbi. Mostly you're going to go to an actual human being to help you answer those questions. And there is a concern that the printing press is going to upset that balance, is going to take power away from rabbis and give that power to texts. And the person who complains about this, I think, most eloquently is Chaim ben Betzalel. Chaim ben Betzalel is the brother of the Maharal, who is the person who is supposed to have made a golem, doesn't actually make a golem, but, there's lots of stories about him making golems. And he, this is how he criticizes it. He says, all those who give instruction solely on the basis of works of Latter-day authors, that is to say, a person who teaches Torah just based on books and nothing else. The person who does that is like a poor person who receives much charity from many wealthy people. From this one grain, from this one wine, from this one fruit, from this one clothing, this one money until he has enough. Another poor person comes and I should be seeing in the first poor person's hand all these things that the wealthy people have bestowed upon him. He thinks him wealthier than all of them and requests sustenance from him. This imbecile does not understand that the first poor person's bread is the bread of affliction, and he has only what these wealthy people have bestowed upon him. So, just to kind of recap the situation, he's saying the use of books, learning things from books, is a lot like a poor person who is borrowing from another poor person, right? The first poor person comes to town, sees people who have all this fabulous wealth, and borrows from them. The second poor person sees the first poor person and says, oh, this person seems to be dressed like a wealthy person, seems to be dressed in wealth, and therefore I assume that this is just a signal of some deep store of knowledge. They have they have great clothing, and that means they have a full bank account, when that is actually not the case. And in fact, that first poor person's wealth is extremely shallow. It's really just the clothing they have on them. What Chaim Ben Betzalel is saying is, when you are looking at words in a book, when you're looking at Torah in a book, it is the same kind of shallowness. Yeah, there is stuff there. There is real Torah there. It is borrowed, so to speak, from rabbis, from living educators, from actual human beings, but it's only surface steep. It's very shallow. And any real depth, any real complexity that you might want to get from the study of Torah is not going to be there. It's not going to be present. And so people will be fooled into thinking that they are exploring these deep wells of knowledge, when in fact they're exploring something very shallow. Now, I think there's something real to that. There's some real there's something important about that. And I think even today, there's ways in which it's hard to communicate certain things in text. There's certain things you actually have to be in a classroom or around human beings or have lived experience for it to learn. So he's right. And even as he's right, he loses, right? Spoiler alert, but the rabbis don't give up on printing. The rabbis love printing, and they go full steam ahead on this. And the books that Chaim Ben Betzalel is criticizing go on to sell like 1 million copies. So he loses, even though he's kind of right. And this is kind of the story over and over again, right? As media technologies develop, there are important critiques, they are noted, and then those people often lose. And so this is not the first time that the rabbis have kind of this concern around what is going to happen when the way that we understand Torah, the way that we package Torah, shifts from one format to another. In this situation, shifts from Torah as being embodied in a human being to Torah as being embodied in text on a page. The reason that I care about this is that if you want to look at the kind of the milestones in this journey of the packaging of Torah and the damage that we've done to packaging of Torah. So one milestone is that division between written and oral Torah. A second one is the invention of the printing press. And I think the third, and perhaps the most significant one, is the development of artificial intelligence. And to kind of play out exactly what I mean and how artificial intelligence is going to have an impact on Torah, I want to show you 2 texts, both of which I created, both of which come from ChatGPT. The first text is this one. Describe Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed in the style of Robin Williams. 1 paragraph only. Guide to the Perplexed being a kind of major work of Jewish philosophy. In the Guide to the Perplexed, I'm not going to do the voice. In the Guide to the Perplexed, Maimonides, the big brain of the medieval world, is like a spiritual GPS for lost souls. He's navigating through this cosmic jungle of space and reason, throwing punchlines at dogma, waltzing with philosophy and Jewish law like it's a comedy club in the heavens. Picture him in a robe and sandals doing stand-up routine. What's the deal with divine attributes, huh? If God's unknowable, then how are we chatting with him like he's our next-door neighbor? He's juggling ideas of God, the universe, everything in between, with a wink and a nudge saying, hey, folks, let's use our noodles, let's not use our knadles. Classic Maimonides, mixing deep thought with a side of humor, serving up enlightenment with a cherry on top. The reason I want to show you this is there is real Torah. There's a real idea here. This is not a misrepresentation of the book, but the format is obviously kind of nonsensical. It's kind of arbitrary. The second text is the reverse. Write a 2-paragraph Shabbat sermon about how the Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim, book of the Bible, is actually about loving tacos. My dear community, this Shabbat, I want to share with you a unique perspective on the Song of Songs. While it is traditionally interpreted as a love poem between man and a woman, it is also possible to see it as a metaphor for our love of tacos. Throughout the text, we can find allusions to spices, meat, other ingredients that are commonly found in tacos. These references suggest that our love of tacos is intertwined with our love for others and with our sense of what is delicious and desirable in the world. Shabbat Shalom. So the reason I want to show you these 2 texts is I think they represent 2 different things that AI can do to Torah content. In the first text, you have an actual Torah idea, right? You have a description of the Guide to the Perplexed put inside of a nonsensical package. In the second, you have a ridiculous idea that a book of the Bible is about tacos put into a recognizable, well-trodden, well-revered format for Jewish thought, which is the Shabbat morning sermon. The reason I want to show you these 2 texts is I think they kind of point to what AI does to the packaging of content, including the packaging of Torah content, which is that it basically takes the cost of taking any idea and putting it in a particular format takes the cost of that down to zero. I can take any idea I want. Doesn't matter if it's a good idea, bad idea, you know, lovely, offensive, doesn't matter what it is, and put it in not just any language that I want, but any register of speech that I want, including registers of speech that we consider typically to be sacred in some way. Sacred either because they remind us of sacred texts, sacred because they remind us of maybe people, the way that people we care about talk, sacred in all kinds of different ways. And that, I think, presents a kind of problem because the rabbis, as we've seen, think that the packaging of Torah matters a lot. It's not just the ideas. It's that the ideas need to be presented in packages that actually suggest a kind of reverence. And we use, even today, the packaging of Torah as a kind of signal that this is not just any old content. This is content that people should kind of like sit up and take seriously. And if AI comes along and says basically like, well, packaging doesn't matter anymore because I can put any content in any package you want, well, that kind of presents a problem. Does the idea that the packaging of Torah cannot actually be preserved in a world where packaging and content are basically completely divorced from each other and any package and any content can be matched? I think there's actually a good response to this within the Jewish tradition, and that comes from a rabbi who I think of as being like the ChatGPT of, you know, the ancient world, a man named Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir is like, he's very good at being a rabbi. Rabbi Acha Bar Chanina says, it's revealed and known before the one who spoke and the world came into being, that Rabbi Meir had no equal in his generation. He's like the best at being a rabbi in his time. Well, if he's the best at being a rabbi, why didn't the sages establish the halacha in accordance with his opinion? If he's so good, then how come he's not always right? How come he's not always right every time he enters into a conversation? Because his colleagues were unable to abide by his conclusions. He would call the pure impure and give an explanation, and he would call the impure pure and give an explanation. That is to say, he could take any verse of the Bible and make it say anything he wanted. Right? The next paragraph. Rabbi Abbaus said that Rabbi Yochanan said Rabbi Meir had a disciple named Sumchus who would give 48 reasons to support a ruling of impurity and 48 reasons to support a ruling of purity. That is to say, they're so good at being rabbis that they can do anything with any verse. And the truth of the matter is, like, this is something that to some degree the rabbis appreciate and love. There's all kinds of examples of rabbis taking verses that clearly mean something and turning them on their head, right? Really good example of this, right? The Bible talks about, you know, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, right? If someone knocks out your eye, you should be allowed to knock out their eye. Like, that's plainly written in the Bible. And the rabbis are like, well, not so fast. And maybe it doesn't mean that. Maybe it means actually the opposite of that, right? So like rabbis are doing that all the time. They're using like pretty sophisticated techniques to transform verses into the way they want. Rabbi Meir is very good at that, but they say he's kind of too good at that. Because yes, he can take any verse and make it say anything you want, but that's not actually what the rabbis want to do. They don't want it to say anything. They don't want it to say 48 different things. They want it to say one thing in particular, and one thing that is, for them, true and good and important for the world. Because the rabbis don't see their job at the end of the day as just like playing with text. They actually see their job as doing some good in the world. They are trying to accomplish something in the world. They're trying to create a world that is better than the world that they found. And they see their job as kind of legislators and regulators as doing that. And so, yes, they care about the technique of transforming verses, but it's always towards a certain end. You can see this really clearly in what the rabbis are concerned about when they enter a day of study. There's this beautiful prayer that the Talmud records about what you're supposed to say when you enter the study hall in the morning. Like, you know, you're clocking in for your day of work. The sages taught when you enter the Beit Midrash, the study hall, what does one say? May it be your will, Lord my God, that no mishap transpires because of me. In America, they would call this like, you know, this is the OSHA regulations. I don't remember what the Canadian equivalent is. Like, these are like the workplace safety rules. You know, I hope there is no workplace accident today because of me. I hope there's no mishap, and that I not fail in any matter of halacha, of Jewish law, that my colleagues will rejoice in me, and that I will neither declare pure that which is impure, nor impure that which is pure, and that my colleagues will not fail in any matter of halacha, and that I will rejoice in them. So the deepest concern that the rabbis have in these situations is, I hope I don't make the wrong ruling. because they recognize, as I think even judges today recognize, that making the wrong ruling can have real world consequences. To kind of bring this back to the problem that I raised before, the problem of separating out Torah content from Torah packaging. I think what this does is it puts an enormous and I think appropriate amount of pressure on the ideas that we transmit as Jewish ideas, of saying like, yeah, this is what Judaism says, this is what Judaism thinks. It is more important than ever to make sure the ideas that we transmit as Jewish ideas are good and are good for the world, because there's a real power to them. And I think it is very easy to imagine a situation where ideas which are less good or are damaging to the world in various ways are transmitted in the name of Torah, or in the kind of the packaging with the accoutrements of Torah, and that ends up actually discrediting Torah as a project, discrediting Torah overall. So there is more pressure than ever, because you can no longer just rely on the packaging itself to kind of carry you there, because anybody can use that packaging. And so it's really important to make sure, as the rabbis want to make sure, that when you actually get to transmitting ideas in the name of Torah, the ideas you're transmitting are the ones that you think are really important and really valuable, and are the ones that are ultimately going to do the most good for the world. That being said, not everyone is a rabbi. Not everyone who studies Torah is a rabbi. And not everyone, even who is a rabbi, is legislating. Meaning, there is another way to think about Torah. Because the way that we were talking about Torah right now is Torah as a kind of work. And I think certainly in the Talmud, the rabbis think about Torah very much as like, this is my job. My job is to kind of like maneuver in Torah, and to kind of think about different ideas within the framework of Torah, and to kind of like fashion biblical verses into different formats. But that's not all the Torah can be. Torah, I think for a lot of people, is something less like work and a little bit closer to play. And by play, I mean, there's been an incredible amount of work done recently about kind of the philosophy of play, what it means to play, and how play is important. And there's a quote from a book by Sithi Nguyen, who's a philosopher, I think at Brigham Young, who I think kind of exemplifies what it means to talk about play as being a central, important activity. He says, games can be an existential balm for our practical unease with the world. In games, the problems can be right-sized for our capacities. Our in-game selves can be right-sized for the problems. The arrangements of self and world can make solving the problems pleasurable, satisfying, interesting, and beautiful. Even with our opponents, there is a harmony. In a good game, our opponents' attempts to harm us may, in the right circumstances, actually be channeled so as to create experiences we value. In ordinary life, social attacks and financial attacks are usually painful and unpleasant. They can be survived and gotten over, but rarely can they be enjoyed. But games are often designed such that your attacks on me are channeled into interesting obstacles for me to overcome. So that is to say, there are some people for whom, like a small number of people for whom, what it means to deal with Torah, what it means to deal with Jewish ideas, is actually to make the world better, to put forward ideas that are going to develop the Jewish community in important ways, to make the world as a whole better. But for many people, Torah is a kind of play. It is a kind of alternate reality that we enter, a reality where we care less about the goal. We care less about how important is it really? Like I understand the details of this text about about an ox goring a person and the financial penalties. Does that really matter? No. What matters is the process by which you get there, the kind of the experience of getting there. So I think there's a lot of ways in which that experience, the experience of kind of the study of Torah as a religious practice, resembles quite a bit the way that Nguyen thinks about play. And in fact, the Talmud itself uses this way of thinking about play at least once. In the Palestinian Talmud, so the version of the Talmud that was written in Palestine between the 3rd and the 5th century, there is a description of Torah as a kind of game. It says that Torah is like a goad that is like a ball passed between girls. Just as this ball goes from hand to hand, but in the end will come to rest in one hand. So Moses received the Torah from Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders to the prophets, and the prophets transmitted it to the men of the great assembly. That is to say, the Torah is like a ball. It's like a ball game that's passed from hand to hand. And there was a kind of playfulness throughout the entire study of Torah. And there's something that I love about that. And between Torah and between work and play, I think there's a kind of middle ground that I find personally the most fascinating. And that is the place where people are clearly both playing with text, but they're doing it towards some kind of constructive end. Some of the most interesting texts, some of the most interesting ideas that are being developed in Jewish thought today are in that middle space, where like it seems kind of like play and kind of like work. I want to show you one example of this. This is from a book called Dear Shuni. Dear Shuni is this, it's now 2 volumes, and there's a combined volume you can get in English. It's a collection of feminist midrash. That is to say, it is a collection of texts that are kind of riffing on ancient and medieval Jewish texts, all of which were written by men, and are attempting to kind of transform those texts into feminist ideas, using their own language, using like using the Hebrew, using the language of the Torah. So Dear Shuni is a collection written by I'd say more than women, who kind of over time were just kind of developing these texts independently, and they compiled it into this book. So Nir Nachliel has this lovely midrash that is based off of this actual passage in the Talmud that asks the question, which is more important, learning Torah or getting married? Understanding that those two things are at odds with each other, because if you get married, you won't be able to learn Torah. And so a wife is understood within the context of this text as just being a kind of obstacle in the path of spending more time learning. Which obviously, first of all, it doesn't allow for the fact of women learning in the first place, and obviously is kind of offensive. And so she is trying to not just like kind of reject it, but actually transform it. So she says, should one learn Torah or marry a woman? That's just a kind of verbatim quote from the Talmud. Then she says, flip it. Learn a woman or marry the Torah, right? The rabbis are not known for like understanding women quite well. This is like a major problem of rabbinic literature. So she's saying maybe you should spend time on that. The halacha is first learn a woman, then marry the Torah. Then we go back to a quote from the Talmud. Can one engage in Torah study with the millstones around one's neck? This is the Talmud asking, can you actually learn Torah if you have a millstone, by which it means a wife who's like holding on to you? Is that actually possible? Again, so she responds, flip it. Can one engage with women with Torah in one's mind? Rather, this is for us, and that is for them. For us, the women, to marry the Torah. For them, the men, to learn a woman. In short, it's sweet. I appreciate texts like this. I think they are in some ways the kind of the future of Torah study. And they are critically important to kind of raise up and champion, because there's all kinds of areas in which Torah study involves a kind of like plotting, revisiting of old texts. But there's also a few select areas, including feminist Torah, queer Torah, Torah around disability, Torah around technology, in which like there actually is there are new things happening. And so I think it's worth looking at those areas, because there's quite a bit of creative work happening in those spaces. And I think this is an example of one. The last bit that I want to get to before opening up to questions is just kind of like thinking bigger picture for a second about what it means for artificial intelligence to be involved in Torah study overall. So Judaism has a surprisingly long relationship with computers, with technology. The very first computer that Israel ever created was, I was going to say christened, but christened seems like the wrong word, was named by Gershom Sholom, who is a major scholar of Kabbalah. And when he was naming it, he agreed. He gave a speech. I'm bungling this. He gave a speech when the computer was turned on for the first time, and he said, "I'll only give the speech if you let me name it." And what he named it is Golem Aleph, the first Golem. But beyond that, one of the things that first computer was used for, one of the people who was involved in creating that first computer wasn't just interested in kind of like scientific experiments. Was interested in like, hey, what if we use this computer to digitize Jewish knowledge? So the process of digitizing Jewish knowledge and the creation of Israel's first computer happened at the same time. And so he does. He goes ahead and spends decades basically like inserting text after text after Jewish text into computers, creating this massive database. that by the 1980s becomes commercially available, turns into what is called today the Bar-Ilan Responsa Project, which is this massive text. You can still buy it. I use it all the time, of texts that are searchable, that are well indexed, that gave people access to Jewish tradition and Jewish information in ways that just radically transformed the way that people study Torah. What it did in part was it kind of changed the balance of like, what do you have to know in order to do a serious investigation of Torah, right? Before a project like this, being a Torah scholar meant you had to know, to memorize the locations of all kinds of different texts, know where particular words appeared, right? It's a study that really kind of rewards people who have excellent memories. After this, once you have digitization, you have a study of Torah, you have a study of Jewish knowledge that is a lot more focused on analysis and ability to ask the right search questions and to query the database in the right way. So there's a way in which these tools aren't just about accessibility. They actually change what it means to study Torah in the first place. And the reason I raise this is that this is a little bit different from the way that other kinds of educational systems work, right? If you are right now in a classroom trying to teach your students mathematics or literature or anything else, you are kind of in crisis because there is this open question about, is it valuable to teach a student a skill that AI can do anyways? Or should I just assume that they're going to have access to AI at every single point in their life? And so what I'm trying to do is teach them how to do the next skill, the skill that AI can't do, build on top of it. Is the skill that I was teaching, like is writing a 5-paragraph essay, is that valuable in and of itself? Or should I say, because, ChatGPT can write a 5-paragraph essay in 10 seconds, therefore my responsibility is now to teach another skill instead. And part of the reason this question is so pressing is because you want to train people to be able to work to function in the workplace, right? You want to give people skills that are actually going to make them succeed in life. Torah, ironically, actually doesn't have that problem. It doesn't have that problem in part because, like, most people don't make money studying Torah. Like, this is not. It is an educational goal, but it is not a goal that is about the pursuit of wealth. It is not a goal that is about the pursuit of a better career for most people. And because of that, what you're trying to optimize for is something different. You are not optimizing for, I want to make my students be able to compete in the marketplace. You are instead optimizing for, how do I make this experience as good as possible? How do I make the experience of studying Torah as good as possible? And if that is the goal, then AI, the kind of the prospects for AI into the future are just astronomical. The things that we can imagine AI doing in the future, I think are even it's hard to kind of even articulate exactly how much we can expect from AI in the future. Just to give one small example of this. One of the things that AI does is it allows people to talk to databases, right? Not just to search a database, not just to kind of like find give me every time it says like this particular word in all of Jewish tradition, but actually to have a conversation with the database. So you can ask it complicated questions. Imagine you have the ability to talk to Maimonides, to actually have a conversation with Maimonides with an AI that knows everything Maimonides ever wrote, every scrap of paper, knows about the lemonade recipe and everything else, knows about every work of secondary scholarship on Maimonides as well. And you can just access that through a conversation without any kind of like prerequisites. It'll just be natural. And what if you could take that conversation with Maimonides and then have this parallel conversation with Moses or with Rabbi Meir or with a whole bunch of different rabbis or a whole bunch of different Jewish figures of history and have them talk to each other and have them talk back to you? I think that's actually not that far away. And I think just based on the track record so far in the 70 or so years of digital Torah, that there is going to be quite a bit of a push towards developing exactly those tools. And so I see this as not just kind of like a nice thing to have, as kind of like, isn't it wonderful that Judaism is embracing of Torah? I actually think it has become a central piece of the identity of Judaism and the Jewish tradition. That Judaism in this way has so embraced Torah, has so embraced technology, has so embraced digital technology, information technology, that the two are actually not separable anymore. It's actually impossible, I think, at this point, to imagine the study of Torah without imagining it as being connected to digital tools in a whole bunch of different ways. And there's something kind of amazing about that, in part because even as this is happening, even as we are developing the ability to kind of like talk to Maimonides and do all these things, we are still reading Torah from scrolls, like literal scrolls. And we are not abandoning either one of those. And one of the things that makes Jewish education and the study of Torah different, I think, from many other kinds of from education, is that even as it expands the kinds of technologies it is able to use, it doesn't abandon the old ones, and it finds a place for each of them. So there's a time and place to use a Torah scroll. There's a time and place to use a book, or to use a digital, or to kind of, talk to an AI that represents a piece of Torah. And in that way, the kind of the rabbinic emphasis on packaging and the rabbinic concern about packaging actually gets preserved, because there is a kind of consciousness about the need to shift which kind of information technology you use based on the kind of interaction with Torah that you want. But this is an area where I'm really excited, in part because there is, as much as we talk about, Jewish leaders as being rabbis and Jewish educators and people who teach in schools and like people in those categories, there is a kind of second class, not second class, but a second category of Jewish leaders who are people who work in the tech sector. These are people that I call pious coders, by which I mean they're Jewish people who are deeply, heavily engaged in the study of Jewish text and want to see that proceed, but it's actually not their main work. Their main work is like working for Microsoft or Google or whatever. That class of I keep saying class. That category of Jews actually has had a major impact on the development of Torah study over the last 70 years, the development of digitized Torah, the development of resources like Sefaria Online simply would not be possible without people like that. And so there is a way in which I really look forward to the way that AI will transform Torah study. I think it is instead of being a situation where there's a kind of just apprehension about like, is this going to ruin all my lesson plans? There's actually a real opportunity to make Torah study more accessible than it's ever been before, and to open up new kinds of ideas and new insights that we would not have had otherwise. We'll stop there and let me ask if there's any questions.
Thank you so much, David Zvi. Thank you. Anybody have any questions? No, I think you've covered it all. Okay, I think we've got no, I don't think we have any questions in the chat either. Okay. Well, thank you very much for the lesson this evening. We really appreciate it. And we're gonna meet one more time in January of the new year. David Zvi, we wish you a Chanukah Sameach and a Chag Orim Sameach. May it be one of light and of joy for you and your family, and God willing, peace for the people of Israel and peace for everyone. One last chance. Anybody have any questions?
I just wanted to say thank you. You raised so many interesting, the thing that I guess it doesn't come down to education, but in terms of writing and the writers' strike and how the not wanting AI to take the place of real writers, which is this whole, a little bit off of the topic of what you talked about, but not completely, the sources of creativity,
Yeah, I mean, I'll say there is. I'm not sure exactly what the legal discussion looks like in Canada right now. In the U.S., there are cases going through the court system around whether works produced with the assistance of AI can be copyrighted. And part of that question is about where does the originality come from, right? At the moment, the court system has said basically no, they cannot be copyrighted. I think most people who work in the arts think that's incorrect or needs to be adjusted, in part because people have all kinds of creative processes they use to develop their work. And And sometimes you use it, a tool that's kind of dumber, and sometimes you use a tool that's smart, like AI. But all of those can be used as part of a creative process. So I think there's going to be some modification that needs to happen, and at the same time, there's real concerns about people losing their jobs and kind of like flooding the internet or flooding media with kind of like pretty tepid and mediocre content just because it's cheaper and can be produced by computers. So finding the balance there is going to be tricky. I actually have like a little bit of it's kind of been lucky or serendipitous in some ways that that AI kind of emerged at a moment when employment is quite high, and so the unions have more ability to kind of like argue for what they need in these situations. I hesitate to think what would happen if we were at a different place in the in the economic cycle. But yeah.
I recall debates that have gone on in years past about before the copyright law, people took inspiration from others flagrantly, and created some beautiful works of music and art and so on. And, there were many people that I'd spoken to and heard talk about decrying, the stifling effect that copyright law has had on creativity. And so it's almost like they can't, with AI, they're not going to be able to control it as much. It can take from everywhere and anywhere, and does, literally every aspect of culture. So, you can't credit your sources in that regard if you were humanly capable of doing it. But, it's a machine. I don't know. It has rights beyond, I guess.
And one of the things that makes it tricky is that for many of these systems, if you have an artist that says, "Hey, I don't want it to be possible." Like, I think Sarah Silverman's one of these people, right? I don't want it to be possible to tell ChatGPT write something in my comedic style. Well, actually, preventing that from happening is kind of difficult, because the way that these models are trained is like, once the model is trained, like, it's in there, it's in the system. You can't just kind of like select it out. And so the remedies for these situations are also going to be quite difficult.
Thank you, Zvi. Anyone else? Okay. Good night in Philadelphia, and good night here in Vancouver. Hopefully we'll see you all tomorrow night at 5:30 at the Hanukkah menorah lighting at the Art Gallery Square, as well as our rally in support of Israel and against anti-Semitism. Don't want to get those backwards. And please come out and please bring your friends. It's going to be quite an evening. Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.